Welcome to our program, Colin Sweet and Mark Toth.
Hey, Daniel, thanks for having us back on the show.
It seems like it was an intense week both for Ukraine and the United States, but I would like to begin with some positive developments. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Sir Keir Starmer, is ready to deploy troops on the ground and deploy planes in the air to enforce a ceasefire deal in Ukraine. I'd like to begin with you, Colonel Sweet. What is your assessment of this plan of deployment of British, French, and other European troops to Ukraine? And do you expect the United States to provide a backstop for this mission?
Well, it's certainly good news that Europe's stepping up and wants to be part of the solution. But for now, Russia has adamantly, and Lavrov just said it on the 26th of February, that they will not accept UN peacekeepers or European peacekeepers, in Russia. And I also doubt that he's going to accept European aircraft over Ukraine. So no news of a ceasefire. I think it would be a positive step if there could be a ceasefire, and that could transpire. But right now, Russia hadn't agreed to anything. So it's still in the good idea box, but it's obviously a favorable outcome that has developed over the past 24 hours.
If Russia, for example, accepts this ceasefire plan, would you see this plan as a good one for Ukraine and for the outcome of this war?
I see it as the beginning of a favorable outcome. Look, it still comes down to where do they draw the line? What remains Russia, what remains Ukraine, and from the perspective of the Donbass, which obviously is raw materials, rare earth materials, rich, it makes a big difference, particularly for Ukraine, but also for the United States now, if they sign the RIM agreement here today, as is possible, given that Zelensky reached out to the president yesterday and said his willingness to sign the deal. Look, it's always a positive development when the missiles stop impacting and when the human waves of Russian troops stop assaulting Ukrainian defensive positions. But once again, at the end of the day, it comes down to whether Russia will actually accept those type of terms. And right now, there's been no willingness to accept concessions, only pile on additional conditions for coming to the negotiations table.
And Mark, what is your take on this plan from a political standpoint? Do you feel that the US would also contribute its, for example, air assets to this mission, as the British Prime Minister is asking US President Donald Trump?
Daniel, it's a fair question. We just don't know enough about what this plan is, save all what Trump is saying is that it's about stopping the killing. But we just don't have the details to determine whether or not it's a good idea or a bad idea. And at this point, I think we've got to take the president at his word that referring to Donald Trump, that he's not prepared to offer U.S. active security guarantees. Now, they were implicit in the deal, the REM deal, that wasn't signed last Friday in the White House. And ultimately, I could foresee those coming about by default. And certainly Trump was signaling that in that meeting with Keir Starmer the day before. When pressed, he said, look, if UK peacekeepers were in Ukraine and if they come under attack, we're not going to be abandoning Britain as our allies. So implying that the U.S. in one way, shape, or form would be doing some form of a backstop. Trump just at this point is not willing domestically and internationally to go there yet and say it. So, when I step back and I look at these negotiations at this point, I see far too much condition setting, as John just said, by the Russians, and not sufficient enough condition setting by Trump and the Ukrainians as to what's acceptable or not to them. We need to see that before we can determine whether or not these ceasefire discussions will be fruitful.
So you're confident that US will help the UK and France in case of attack in Ukraine on their troops?
If it comes to that, I have to believe that the U.S. would do that. It would be too much of a sign of weakness, if you will, if Russia were allowed to attack key allies of the U.S. And then you get into the murky area of those allies yet still being members of NATO. So even though they may not be there as a NATO peacekeeping force, they nonetheless wear the flags of NATO member states. So I really do think one way or the other, from a legal obligation, international law standpoint, we would be obligated either just as good allies or under the NATO aegis of having to come to their defense. That may be more of a question for John to answer in terms of what he thinks NATO would do or not do under those circumstances.
Sure, John. What are the U.S. military options for retaliation in case of Russia's attack on European troops on the ground in Ukraine?
Look, it runs the full spectrum of capabilities from tactical to strategic options that the United States would have to respond. But let's remember, they will respond in accordance with what they agree to with either the United Kingdom or France on how they will back them up. So let's not get too deep into a hypothetical right now. But yes, as Mark said, a bilateral type of force on the ground versus a NATO force. But then again, at the end of the day, that force is a NATO member, and the U.S. would provide some sort of support, but that would be agreed upon well before the ground forces were introduced to the theater.
This also covers U.S. aid for Ukraine. U.S. President Trump is halting military shipment of military goods to Ukraine, and also there is reportedly a pause in intelligence sharing. What is your reaction to this, Colonel Sweet, and do you see this as a negotiating tactics?
It is, unfortunately, and I'm disappointed in that particular course of action that they're using to try to bring the European partners into the fold. Look, by denying weapons, by denying ammunition, by denying intelligence, it may send a political message, but the message it's going to send to Russia is that they are now enabled and empowered to continue their attacks, which will be, as a result, more lethal against Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian military forces. Without the intelligence and without the weapons to defend themselves against those bombardments, it's only going to get worse. And unfortunately, I think that will be blood on Trump's hands.
Also, according to Sky News sources, U.S. halted intelligence sharing with Ukraine only related to Ukrainian ability to strike deep inside Russia. What is your assessment of this decision, Colonel Sweet?
Well, my assessment of that decision is that, again, it's the United States giving in to Russia concessions, okay? Russia wants the fighting to stop, but not Russian fighting to stop, but Ukraine's ability to counter them. And the deep strikes that Ukraine is putting on Russia is crippling their wartime economy, and it is preventing them from raising funds to continue to fight. Now, of course, they don't want those areas to be bombarded, and they've turned to the United States and said, stop it. But they haven't stopped, right? Russia isn't stopping their assaults on Ukrainian cities and key energy infrastructure. So it's a one-sided deal, which in my mind, from a military perspective, makes absolutely no sense.
And Mark, what is your assessment of this decision of the White House to halt military aid to Ukraine and also to stop some forms of intelligence sharing between the US and Ukrainian military intelligence?
Right. As John said, it is a negotiating tactic, but it's a terrible way to go about it. I mean, it's egregious in my mind. At some point, because of these pauses, especially since Ukraine faces going blind in deep strikes against Russia, potentially drone launch sites, ballistic missile sites that they can't hit or as easily hit. Some Ukrainian civilian, a man, a woman, a child, God forbid, is going to die as a result. So, as an American, I'm embarrassed that we've gone there. I don't think it's appropriate. I think there's a better way to figure this out between the two countries. And it really comes down to just, as someone that studies and analyzes national security, you don't make these kind of decisions, from an emotional standpoint. Great. All right. You're offended by someone not wearing a suit. Great. You didn't think someone said thank you enough. Great. You didn't like the facial expressions that he was using. That's all fine. Have that conversation in private, but you don't make strategic decisions that have global impact based on any of that. That's child's play, and it should never have gotten to that point. So, from my perspective, I believe that Trump and his advisors, they lost the plot, as we come to say when we're writing. And the bigger plot here is that China and Russia are watching. They're seeing how easily Trump was, sidelined, sidetracked, if you will, by this fisticuffs that happened in the Oval Office, and it makes no sense. And so it needs to end and end fast. Now, there was some positive signaling. I don't want to leave everyone in a depressed state. Fortunately, in I'm not the State of the Union, but technically, the first year of a presidency is called the Joint Address to Congress. But in Trump's speech last night to Congress, he signaled that, look, there's a way to walk this back. Mike Waltz, his national security advisor, was on TV today doing the same, basically saying, look, there's a pathway. He's working with his guys at NSA and elsewhere to try to figure out how to walk this back, how to get Ukraine and Trump back on, a glide path to sign the IRM deal, and then hopefully, as he said, resume the aid. He didn't specifically mention the intel side of it, but the questioner, Brian Kilmeade on Fox News, did raise that, and so that was implied that could be on a path to getting restored. It can't be restored too soon from a moral standpoint, but also an ethical one.
And also, Mark, do you see this decision to stop aiding Ukraine as an emotional one from Donald Trump?
Absolutely, Daniel. It was completely emotional. It could have been set up. Look, you had the joint address happening last night, days before when Zelensky were in the office. Some of this could have been some completely theater design to placate the American people. Change, when it comes, takes time. The U.S. economy obviously isn't going to turn on a dime. It could be that Trump was designing all of this just for some domestic consumption. So you have to bear that in mind. I think for Ukraine, however, it's going to be important for them to change negotiating tact with the U.S. Granted, I get it. No one that looks at national security, and certainly John, as my writing partner who's lived it in terms of being an intel officer, would argue that, security guarantees from the U.S. are needed. They're paramount. It's the only way that you can ensure long-term peace. But I think for Ukraine, if Zelensky or something happens to come across these comments, what I would suggest doing is making this more economic in terms of your discussions with Trump, because that's what he listens to. And I would start having this argument that, hey, of this $11.5 trillion worth of rare earth minerals that are in Ukraine, a best estimate from a professor in Liev is that about half of those, or 5.75 trillion, are in areas currently controlled by Russia. So if Trump really wants to get a good deal and he wants to capitalize on it, and he loves exaggerating things, then I'd start having that negotiations of saying, look, here's key areas of Ukraine in the Donbass or in Crimea or wherever that we need to get back, because it's only going to make this REM deal with you all the more valuable, and the overall reconstruction fund that's part of it or encompasses it. So that would be my argument there for how Ukraine can proceed and get this back on track, and using the language that Trump responds best to, which is business.
And Colin Sweet, how can we get back on this track, as just Mark said, from a military standpoint? What should be the main focus of our discussions with the United States and European allies?
Well, I think the main discussion ought to be something that hasn't been pressed yet, is get Russia to stop firing ballistic missiles into Ukrainian cities, get Russia to stop, human wave assaults into Ukrainian fortifications, get Russia to stop purchasing weapons from North Korea and Iran, and get Russia to stop flooding Ukraine with soldiers, okay? That's the problem. Russia is the aggressor, and I think what this administration fails to acknowledge, at least publicly, is that Russia is attacking. It's not that Ukraine doesn't want peace. Ukraine wants peace, but Ukraine is not going to sit back and get overrun. So they're more than willing to defend their positions. If I'm not mistaken, the count yesterday was about 1,240 Russian soldiers that were wounded or killed in action as they were assaulting Ukrainian positions. So the position has to be get Russia to stop.
Let's cover also this intense meeting in the White House last Friday. What is your take on that, Mark? How can you assess this intense debate between President Zelensky, Trump, and J.D. Vance?
Right. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, I think you have to look at it on several levels. And I would look at it just from the standpoint of trying to understand what happened and the implications of it. There's domestic ways to look at it. There's global ways to look at it. I think the domestic message, or at least the pressure that Trump was under, is he probably wanted to sign an agreement in advance of this joint Congress speech that he gave last night. And, $1 trillion, as he's arguing that this deal is valued at, would have been made for good ink, good press, if you will, in terms of people writing the headlines today. That obviously didn't happen. I think if there was a plan, a plot, if you will, to set Zelensky up, to set him off, it was, to get him to, at some point, apologize on air during that press break and then, proceed forward and get it signed. But it went right. You have J.D. Vance, I think, pouring more gas on it. And there's certainly people around Trump that believe that we're doing too much with Ukraine. And they're looking at we're doing too much with Europe in general as a cultural war. If you go back to J.D. Vance's, the vice president, address to the Munich conference, he wasn't talking about the security threats from without, or, in terms of those coming from Russia. He was talking about the security threats to Europe from within. So you have a little bit of different world viewpoints that are happening that I believe rose to the top in that discussion, fueled the thing. And then understandably, Zelensky is a man, I mean, if we look at him, this is a man who's aged 10 years in 3 years. This is a man who's carrying the weight of his country, understands the horrible cost that your population is borne in fighting this war, and it's a just war. And I get it. He knows, your country having been invaded twice by Russia now in the last 10 years, he knows, 11 years actually, he knows that a third time is coming if he doesn't have more substantial security guarantees. So it was just unfortunate. Look, Zelensky was in the right direction. I can't blame him from a national security standpoint for demanding what he was asking for in that meeting. But, sometimes you just have to read the room. And I think those around him probably just said, keep this on an economic discussion at this point, and to the extent that you need to raise the security guarantees, do that in private. And that's probably, good advice for him going forward.
And don't you think that this clash between J.D. Vance and Zelensky was staged before, was planned by Trump's team?
I do. I mean, it has the elements of it. Obviously, I can't know. I don't have any proof, so I've got to be careful here as John and I, as journalists. We can't assert something that we don't have factual basis for, but it certainly felt like it, right? I mean, it was either that or there is another explanation to it. It's just a lot of resentment between these parties that just came to the fore. Discussions that we've not been privy to that were heated. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, not too long afterwards, after that meeting, chimed in and saying, look, Zelensky was yelling at me in Kiev, when I first came to sign it. Now, what Bessent left out was basically the first deal that he brought was an extortion deal. It was basically the U.S. gets everything, $500 billion, and Ukraine got nothing. It was somehow just to be some kind of payback, even though the Biden administration, the previous president, had given, and Congress with congressional authority, had provided for most of those to be outright grants, not loans. So, I believe there's just a lot of ill will there happening as well. And so it's probably, kind of an all of the above situation where there was a little bit of setup, a little bit of heat from backroom disagreements, and then the messaging that was going on. But I think, again, because I'd like to put an exclamation point on this, what Trump failed to understand in that meeting, what J.D. Vance especially failed to understand in that meeting, was that Russia and China were watching. And that is not something that was in the U.S. national security interest for them to be seeing. It could, eventually be catastrophic if not corrected.
And also, Colonel Sweet, it is interesting that recently U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance said that he does not support, does not think that deploying European troops would be the best security guarantee for Ukraine, because both countries didn't participate in major wars in the last 30 or 40 years. Why did he forget about the commitment, the participation in U.S. major wars by the United Kingdom and France?
Yeah, conveniently forgot about the United Kingdom's support to Operation not Desert Storm, but Iraqi Freedom, also Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, and has forgotten the United Kingdom has participated in strikes against the Houthi rebels and also securing airspace over Israel. So look, the one thing I think the vice president forgot is you get respect by giving respect. Okay. And the vice president to date has failed to offer any respect for anyone other than his boss, the president. And that's got to change, because words like disrespectful and insult are words that are triggers for the president to get highly upset. And I think we saw it firsthand in the Oval Office. And when you look at the article that Mark Toth and I wrote in the Kiev Post last week about, tombstones, or the Oval Office's tombstones version of the OK Corral, we lay out pretty much what we saw and what we think. And we also lay out what we think is, a possible way ahead. And we're starting to see that. At least, Zelensky came forward and said, look, it's regrettable that it occurred. We need to get back on track. And he swallowed a little bit of pride in doing that, but he's doing it for the right reasons. And that is the security of Ukraine and their long-term sovereignty.
Thank you, Colin Sweet and Mark Toth, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Hey, Daniel, thanks for having us back on.
Thank you, Daniel. Appreciate it.